Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Joan Twist. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Civic Partnerships. I'm here with Connie Chan-Robison and Stephanie Carroll, who are with the Center for Collaborative Planning. Connie is the Executive Director and will be our moderator today. Both of our offices are here in Sacramento, and we're both part of the Public Health Institute. I want to welcome you to the second in a series of programs under the rubric Increasing Your Sustainability Odds. This webinar is entitled Lobbying and Advocacy 101, Legal Tips for Nonprofit Advocates and Tools to Help Get Started. The California Wellness Foundation has supported our work to improve organizational capacity and sustainability. Late in 2014, you were invited to attend a training. There were two offerings held, one in Burbank and one in Sacramento. Among the feedback we received was interest in going deeper into the policy arena to sustain your organizational mission. Ms. Rebecca Hamburg-Cappy, West Coast Director for the Alliance for Justice, participated in the Sacramento training and generously offered to provide her expertise and experience to one of our follow-up webinars. This best practice webinar will include an informational presentation, practical tools, and time for questions and answers. The webinar is scheduled to run until 2:30 p.m. Our agenda follows. I will do housekeeping in a moment, then we'll have the presentation, Worry-Free Advocacy for Nonprofits, Keeping It Legal, moderated by Connie Chan-Robison, Executive Director of the Center for Collaborative Planning, with Rebecca Hamburg-Cappy presenting. There'll be time for chat throughout, and then there will be question and answers via chat at the end, and we'll have a wrap-up and close. By way of housekeeping, we want you to know that we are recording the session. All of your lines are muted, and on the very first slide that was on for quite a while, you had the number for technical difficulties. I'll read it again. It's 1-866-229-3239. And you see a note there about the recording and slides. They're going to be available next week, and I will repeat this again at the end of the webinar and tell you about an email you're going to receive, which will have this link and a link to the evaluation, and that will all come next week. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the mic over to Connie Chan-Robison, who has partnered so well with us on this project, and we're so happy to be part of it with her.
Thanks so much, Joan. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome so much to this webinar in follow-up to the in-person trainings that Joan mentioned. I'm really delighted this afternoon to introduce to you all Rebecca Hamburg-Cappy, who is the West Coast Director for the Alliance for Justice. Just a little bit about Rebecca before I turn the mic over to her to do her presentation. Rebecca is the Director of Alliance for Justice's office in Oakland, California. In addition to leading AFJ's Justice Program work on the West Coast, she provides live and web-based trainings and technical assistance through AFJ's Boulder Advocacy Initiative for nonprofit advocates and foundations to ensure that they have the knowledge they need to become confident advocates and the resources and the tools to help them navigate the complexity of the advocacy roles. Rebecca has litigated a variety of employment discrimination, civil rights, and human rights cases on behalf of plaintiffs around the country. She received her JD from the George Washington University Law School and her BA in Political Science, International Relations from the University of California, San Diego at Eleanor Roosevelt College. Rebecca will be doing her presentation. As Joan mentioned, there will be interim various opportunities for Q&A, at which time I will give direction to everybody for how to submit their questions, as well as a general chat room question and answer period at the very end of our presentation. Without further ado, I want to welcome Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining us and offering your expertise and experiences in this very complex issue and opportunity to learn from you.
Thanks so much, Connie, and thanks, Joan, both of you, for the invitation to be here today with everyone, as well as for that lovely introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. There, as Connie mentioned, there are really two parts to the webinar. The first part, we're going to talk about the legal rules for advocacy, and then the second part, I'm going to share a couple of tools that AFJ has developed for helping you to evaluate and assess your readiness to engage in both advocacy and community organizing. So I hope that those will both be useful for you, and I want to mention at the outset that Alliance for Justice is an organization of over 100 members across the country, all nonprofits and foundation affinity groups, who work on a variety of social justice issues, from everything from environmental to public health to other social welfare issues, reproductive justice, and the like. We have been around since 1979, providing this information to organizations such as yourselves. And we have a technical assistance hotline that is free for folks to call. So if you have any questions after the webinar or at any point while you're engaging in advocacy about the rules, you can do that by calling 1-866-NP-LOBBY. I'll put that up at the end of the presentation. And you can also email us with your questions. That's a free service that we offer to everyone, in addition to our workshops and trainings, as Connie mentioned. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Sorry, just taking a second here for the agenda to come up. So we're going to talk first about comparing the different types of nonprofits. I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the different types. You may be familiar with them already, but just so we're on the same page. We're going to talk about what advocacy is and why it's an important tool. We're also going to talk about the IRS lobbying limits for 501c3 organizations. The Internal Revenue Service is where we get our limits on lobbying. Lobbying is just one form of advocacy, as we'll talk about in a little bit. We're going to talk about how the IRS defines lobbying for 501c3s and give you some tips for how you can maximize that lobbying limit. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to move into talking about the tools that we have for evaluating and assessing your advocacy and community organizing work. So with that, let's start with comparing nonprofits. So the two big categories of nonprofits that I want to talk about today are 501c3s, or public charities. That is the term that the IRS uses. Public charities include both traditional nonprofits as well as foundations. They have some different rules. I'm going to be spending my time talking about public charities, so when I use the term nonprofit, I'm really limiting myself today to public charities. And you can see a couple of examples there. The Alliance for Justice itself is a 501c3. We have a related, what's called a 501c4, colloquially known as a social welfare organization. And that's our Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. It's very common for C3s to have affiliated C4s and vice versa, and that vice versa is depicted here with the Sierra Club. Sierra Club is itself a C4, and it has an affiliated C3 called the Sierra Club Foundation. So, taking a look at what that means, there are some differences in tax treatment, in how lobbying activities are calculated, and how much electoral activity is allowed. So starting with the tax treatment piece, C3 organizations are tax exempt, meaning the income that they bring in is exempt from taxes. Contributions that are made to 501c3s are tax deductible to the person who contributes. And the C3s are typically where you see the private foundation grants. On the C4 side, you don't have the tax deductibility of contributions, and there are some ways that foundations can give grants to C4s, but typically we see that mostly with C3s. In terms of lobbying activity, you'll see here that it says that for C3s, Lobbying is limited. That's where we're going to spend most of our time in this first part of the webinar, talking about the limits on C3 lobbying activities. For C4, lobbying is unlimited. So that is one of the advantages and reasons why organizations that have a C3 arm might set up a C4 arm, is if they are getting close to or think that the activities that they're going to be engaging in will exceed their lobbying limits, and I'll get into the definitions of that in a few minutes. And then finally, the big stoplight for C3s is that we cannot support or oppose a candidate for office, otherwise known as partisan political activity. On the flip side for C4s, that is engaging in electoral activities is something that is more or less expected, at least as part of their mission. Now, it can be a secondary activity. It cannot be the primary purpose for which the C4 is formed. And then the limits there are that the C4 needs to follow federal and state election law. So that was just a quick overview of the two different types. I'm going to move into what is advocacy. As I mentioned earlier, not all advocacy is lobbying, but all lobbying is considered advocacy. So here we're talking about all of these things, and I like to say this is my favorite slide because it gives you an idea of all of the things that you can do that are neither partisan political activity or lobbying. So organizing in your communities, educating the public, bringing cases in court in litigation, conducting research, encouraging people to get out and vote. All of those things are just general forms of advocacy, and there are no limits. You should be getting out there and doing all of those things just to encourage folks to participate and spread the word about whatever your mission or issues are. Now, you see that lobbying there is in yellow. That means that there are some rules that we're going to talk about, some limits on how far you can, on what you can do and how you can do it, and also on what counts. So we just like to put that in yellow, not because you can't do it or that nonprofits shouldn't do it. They absolutely can. The IRS is very clear about that, and we think that they should, but we want to make sure that you do it within the rules that have been set out. And then as you can see here also, the partisan political activity, as I mentioned before, is the big red stop sign for 501c3 organizations. All of the information that I'm going to talk about today, I'm just going to repeat myself and say, is going to be relevant to 501c3s. If you work for a C4 or have other questions about that, that would be a great thing for us to talk about either via our technical assistance line or sending an email. So just a couple of examples of general advocacy and lobbying, and we'll talk about whether these things count as lobbying as we get into this, but here's a action alert that was sent by the California Family Resource Association asking for support of a bill that they were working on. Here's another example from that same organization that was about submitting comments on regulation, so administrative advocacy. And then here is a webinar that the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles put on to educate people about the new ACA when it was new, the Affordable Care Act, and to help folks understand its complexities and application to them. So getting into why advocacy. So one reason why organizations will engage in advocacy and why we think it's really important to do so is potentially to protect your current funding and to maybe seek more funding. I think it's a pretty common way in which folks engage in advocacy, that budget advocacy piece. Of course, educating lawmakers to receive better policy, to get better policies, is a big one. You really are the expert as the people on the ground doing the work with the communities, if you're, especially if you're a direct service provider. And lawmakers love nothing better than to hear from their own constituents about the issues that matter to them. So if there is an issue that really matters to your community, getting out there and educating lawmakers to encourage them to enact better policies really is something that they love to hear. So getting to know your lawmakers, of course, allows them in turn to get to know you, and so engaging in advocacy it gives you a doorway for that. Of course, empowering your constituents and communities is a big reason why we encourage folks to engage in advocacy. You want to bring those folks along to get community buy-in and to empower the people who are there and affected by what's happening to engage in this work. And of course, creating change is a big reason why we encourage folks to engage in advocacy. And all of that is to just say that, and remind you that nonprofits can and should advocate and lobby for policy change. It's a great way to help build and sustain your mission by encouraging folks to think about holistically the problems that they're trying to address through whatever services they're providing, and especially if there are pieces of it that can't be won just by providing those services, but by actually going in and seeking policy change and changing the community and the environments around you. I think that's something that all of us understand and can appreciate, but I'm just reiterating it for you here. So some lobbying key points, moving on to what the IRS says about lobbying. One, of course, nonprofits can and should lobby. They just have to stay within their annual lobbying limits, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Most 501c3s will benefit from something called the 501h expenditure test. There are two ways in which the IRS measures lobbying. Actually, there's a default test and then there's the 501h expenditure test. We'll talk about both in just a second. And we really encourage organizations to make that 501h election when it makes sense for them. It gives you much clearer rules, as we'll talk about in just a minute. Many of the activities that influence policy will not meet the definition of lobbying. And that kind of goes back to that stoplight slide that I showed you a few minutes ago. All of those things that were in green don't meet the definition of lobbying, and there are very specific rules for what does. So we'll talk about that so that you understand. And then I just want to point out, because I think there are a number of you who receive government funding sources, there are special restrictions that you should keep in mind and really look at. We're not going to talk about those today, but I just want to flag it that receiving funding from government sources often attaches additional restrictions. So how much lobbying? As I mentioned, there are two tests. The first or default test is called the insubstantial part test. This is the test that the IRS uses if no election has been made. We'll talk about making the election in just a second. Insubstantial part is defined by the IRS, or is not defined by the IRS, sorry, and it's very vague. It's just one of those standards that isn't much of a standard at all. We've heard that it could be as much as maybe 5% of what you're doing, but it's a very small percentage of the work that you do. One of the big disadvantages, frankly, of the insubstantial part test is that you're counting activities and not just expenditures. So those activities would include things like volunteer time. So anytime you're engaging in volunteers, you have to think about that. Anything that you're doing to influence legislation under the insubstantial part test will count. So you rack up those amounts very quickly. The other test, as I mentioned, is called the 501h expenditure test. I mentioned that it's an election. There's a form that you fill out. It is probably the easiest form that any government agency has ever come up with. It is half a page. It's IRS Form 5768. It's a one-time form that you have to fill out. If you can't remember whether you filled it out, you can go ahead and send it in again. No penalties are going to be incurred. But when you do make the election under the 501h test, you get dollar-based lobbying limits, which we'll talk about in a second. You get clear definitions of lobbying. And as I mentioned before with the insubstantial part test, unlike that one, under the 501h, only your expenditures will count. And we'll get into that in a second. We have a very introductory guide if you're not sure if your organization has made the 501h election and you want to learn more about it. That's there on the right side of your screen, called Worry-Free Lobbying for Nonprofits, How to Use the 501h Election. and I'd encourage you to get that. All of our resources and publications that I'm going to be talking about today are available at www.boulderadvocacy.org, and that's Boulder, B-O-L-D-E-R, which I'll also give you at the end again, so don't worry about writing it down now. Everything that I talk about today is available in one of our resources. So let's talk about those lobbying limits. So to calculate your lobbying limit, you want to look at what the IRS calls your exempt purpose expenditures. For most organizations, those limits are going to be based on your annual expenditures. What's in your annual budget? And we have tools on our website, again, to help you calculate this, but you want to figure out how much your annual expenditures are. And then, based on how much your annual expenditures are, the IRS sets a percentage plus dollar amount limit depending on your budget. And you can see that here. Now, for any organization that has a budget of less than $17 million a year, we would encourage you to make the lobbying, to make the 501H election. Again, because you get the clear rules, you know what to expect. And with the insubstantial part test, you don't. So, so that's how you get your overall lobbying limit. And then we'll talk about this in a second. Your grassroots lobbying limit, which is one form of lobbying, so there's direct and grassroots lobbying. Your grassroots lobbying limit is only 25% of that overall limit. So I'm going to give you a more concrete example on the next slide, and we'll talk more about the difference between direct and grassroots lobbying in a few slides. But suffice it to say, the thing to remember here is that for whatever reason, the IRS has said that grassroots lobbying can only be 25% of your overall limit. So let's take a look at a concrete example. So here's an organization with annual expenditures of $2 million. You'll see in that orange piece of the pie that that's all of the activities that you can do that you don't need to think about in terms of the IRS's limits. And then you have the two slices, your direct and grassroots. Now those two pieces are a little bit, I don't want to say misleading. That's not the word, but you could do all of your activities on direct lobbying. You could do no grassroots lobbying. That's perfectly allowed. So for this organization that has a $2 million budget, their overall lobbying limit is $250,000. That $250,000, as I said, can be spent all on direct lobbying. But as you see right below that, your grassroots lobbying limit, that little purple slice, can only be up to $62,500 in terms of the amount of money that you're spending on that work. And again, we'll talk about what the difference is between direct and grassroots lobbying in a second. But those are just limits to keep in mind so that when you're engaging in work, you can see where you might want to shift your message, your tactics, so that you can take advantage of every bit of the amount of money that the IRS gives you. Most organizations never get close to their lobbying limit, even if they're doing a lot of it. So this is really, once you've been able to make the 501H election and understand what the limits are, this just really helps to move forward. So I haven't mentioned what it is yet, what the definition of lobbying is. I'm going to get into that right now. Again, these definitions are the definitions that are available to organizations who've made the 501H election. Organizations using the insubstantial part test cannot really rely on these definitions. So again, just to encourage you one more time to make that election if you haven't already. All right, so starting with direct lobbying. Direct lobbying involves a communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation. And we're going to break that down into its component parts. You have to have all of them in order to meet the definition of direct lobbying. Now, these rules are not so fuzzy in the sense that if you don't meet all of your component parts, you really don't need to worry about whether it's lobbying. So if it's not a communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation, if it doesn't do all of those things, then it's not lobbying and it doesn't count against your limit. So what is a communication? I think this is things that we think about sort of every day. This is probably the least complicated piece of it. Right now I'm communicating with you all. You could have sent me an email. I know Connie and I had many emails before the webinar today. I could be making a phone call to someone. Any form of communication. We've also seen some creative forms of communication, like an organization sending cake with a message on it and a piece taken out to legislators. So anytime that you're conveying information, communicating in the traditional sort of sense of the word, that would likely be a communication. But who's a legislator? Well, it includes both federal, state, and local officials, as well as their staff. So members of Congress, state assembly members, state senate members, city council members, county boards of supervisor members. All of those are, I think, what we traditionally think of as legislators. But again, the rule is that the legislator includes their staff. So that is something to keep in mind when you're communicating with the office of the legislator. You're communicating, for the purposes of the IRS's definition, with the legislator himself or herself. So here's a picture that I think some of you may be familiar with. This is Governor Brown signing the paid sick days legislation last year. And one of the things to keep in mind is that sometimes executive branch officials, like the president or Governor Brown or a mayor or other executive official, will be participating in the formulation of legislation. And in those situations, the IRS considers them to be acting as legislators. And their actions, if you're trying to influence Governor Brown, for instance, to sign that piece of sick days legislation, would count as lobbying. So here's another example. When would Secretary of Health and Human Services Sylvia Burwell be considered a legislator? Again, anyone that has the ability to influence a piece of legislation is broadly considered a legislator. So there are really two times when she might be considered a legislator, or where there's two different examples that I'm going to give you. So in one example, if Sylvia Burwell were being asked to work on regulations that are within HHS's purview, you know, if you asked her to implement some regulations, for instance, around the Affordable Care Act, that action would be her action as an administrator and not a legislator. And when she's acting as that administrator, it doesn't count as being a legislator for the purposes of the IRS. However, if there were, and we know that there have been a lot of measures, especially with the new Congress, to challenge different portions of the Affordable Care Act, and if you wanted her to weigh in with those legislators in Congress about what should happen on those various pieces of legislation to either broaden or contract portions of the Affordable Care Act, asking her to do that would be having her engage in her legislative function, and she'd be considered a legislator. So there's one special legislative rule that I want to tell you about, and this may have come up for some of you in the fall if you were working on things like Prop 47 or any of the other propositions that were on the ballot. Sometimes the public is considered legislators, and that is when they are being asked to vote on ballot measures, ballot initiatives, referenda, constitutional amendments, and bond measures. For those purposes, the general public are considered unpaid legislators by the IRS, and your communications with them are considered under the direct lobbying rule. Now, because they're direct lobbying, it's actually good news, because you'll remember from the pie chart slide that you can spend all of your lobbying limit on direct lobbying. So you actually have a lot more of your budget that you can use in those years when you're advocating for or against ballot measures to spend on that activity. So here's one place where the IRS has specifically listed for us that certain bodies are not considered to be legislative bodies, and thus the people who sit on them are not legislators. And they refer to them, the IRS refers to those bodies as special purpose boards. They include school boards, planning commissions, zoning commissions, and water districts. I can't give you much more clarity than that. It's one of the many places in the IRS rules where they don't give a whole lot of rationale for why that is, but I can tell you that those 4 bodies that are listed there are specifically listed in the IRS regulations as being special purpose bodies not to be considered legislators. Something that we tend to say about these bodies is that they usually make recommendations to others. They have some sort of limit on their power, and the activities before these bodies are likely subject to state and local law. But beyond that, not much I can say about it other than to keep in mind that these types of bodies are not considered legislators for the purposes of the IRS's definition of what constitutes lobbying. So moving on to expressing a view about specific legislation, trying to figure out when something is specific legislation could be as easy as knowing that something has a bill number or a name, again, like the Affordable Care Act or this Clean Energy Bill, HR 2454. It's really hard to avoid expressing a view unless you're just asking for a status update on something like this when you're communicating with a legislator. So the expressing a view part is not the problem. The issue is it specific legislation? So a couple other examples. The budget, appropriations and taxes, as well as the budget, are considered pieces of legislation, specific legislation for the purposes of the IRS's rules. That's partly because, again, the interaction happens both from the governor, but also in the legislative bodies, or the president and Congress. That interaction over the piece of information tends to make it specific legislation. So just keeping in mind that the budget is considered specific legislation. Here is Justice Sonia Sotomayor at her confirmation hearing. I've included this because confirmation of judges and other appointments that require Senate or other legislative confirmation are considered to be specific legislation. So all of those judges that are that get confirmed in the Senate or challenged in the Senate, all of that work that happens around the confirmation process is refers to specific legislation. That's something that we at AFJ engage in a lot. So we're very familiar with the rules around those. And then my lovely gentleman here with his bright idea. Sometimes you have a bright idea that is bright enough that you've identified a specific problem and presented a specific solution that would essentially allow the legislator to go back and write a bill about it. And again, this is sort of a fuzzy line, so something to just kind of keep in mind if you think you're getting there. Because one of the things that I haven't mentioned so far is that not only do you need to know that the specific legislation is, like, knowing that something is specific legislation brings it into the area of lobbying, but the time that you spend preparing to lobby also counts against your limit. So traveling to that meeting on the Hill and things like that. So on the bright idea issue, if you go to your legislator just to talk about the problem of violence in your community and the idea that there is this problem and you want them to do something about it without more, that's probably not enough to constitute specific legislation. But if you go in and say that gun violence is really the problem and we want to put some sort of restrictions or regulations on gun ownership, without sort of getting into maybe more specifics, but just saying that would probably be something where you've provided a solution to a problem. You think more regulations on gun ownership will reduce gun violence. And so that communication would likely count as expressing a view on specific legislation in terms of what the IRS has said. So there are some times when pieces of legislation, just like where there's an exception for the legislators, there are certain types of communications that don't result in specific legislation, even though you might otherwise think that they are. And this is just one of many places where I'm going to flag for you that the IRS is talking about your overall lobbying limit. There's also limits on the disclosures that are not limits, but regulations on disclosures that happen at the state and local level. I'll talk about that in a minute. So some of the exceptions for not specific legislation according to the IRS are when you engage in communications related to regulations, regulatory activity, or things that we call administrative advocacy generally. So in addition to regulations, executive orders. So if you were trying to influence the president, in enacting more immigration reforms. If he was doing it through his executive authority, that communication would not be lobbying. If you, again, were talking to Sylvia Burwell about something within her command, those are regulations, administrative advocacy, not considered specific legislation, thus not lobbying. Once a bill has been passed and you ask an agency or someone else to enforce that existing law, not considered specific legislation, thus not lobbying. And then litigation. If you go into court to challenge a piece of legislation, that activity is not considered specific legislation. So we're going to do a little quiz here, and for this part, you're going to go ahead and use that chat feature and let us know whether you think that the following things are lobbying or not lobbying. I think Stephanie is just putting up the thing to show you how you get to the chat feature there. So I'll wait for just a second so we can go back to the other page. So if you are urging your, sorry, I think I need the ball back, Stephanie. Here we go. Thanks. All right, so if you're urging a city council member to pass a local living wage ordinance, do we think that that's lobbying or not lobbying? I'll give you a couple minutes, a couple seconds to answer. Urging city council members to pass a local living wage ordinance, lobbying or not lobbying? I see a couple answers coming in over the chat. And everyone that's chimed in so far is absolutely correct. This would be lobbying, right? Very clearly communicating with a legislator here, the City Council, about passing specific legislation, that local living wage ordinance. How about meeting with local police to urge them to stop racial profiling? Lobbying or not lobbying? Oh, you guys are good. Not lobbying. That's right. The local police are not considered legislators. So meeting with them to urge them to stop racial profiling, not lobbying. You can do that all you want. We also had a lot of people doing that around with the local police around things like ICE holds and how many immigrants were being detained in our jails. There was a lot of advocacy here in California happening around that. That was not lobbying activity when it was talking to local police and law enforcement. And of course, you know, talking to them about local tactics in policing is not lobbying. So we shall all be out there doing it. All right, urging the Department of, the DHS Secretary to support the DREAM Act and to reform immigration enforcement practices by DHS. Lobbying or not lobbying? All right, so the last commentator right there, Kristen wins the prize. This one is partially lobbying and partially not lobbying. The first half of that, asking the Department of Homeland Security Secretary to support the DREAM Act, would be asking them to engage in influencing a piece of legislation. That part's lobbying. The second part, asking them to reform immigration enforcement practices, something within their own purview, is not lobbying. So sort of a trick question. Don't want to trip people up, but just so you can see that there might be a single communication that you make that might be both lobbying and not lobbying. So, all right. Last one, urging legislators in another state to pass foreclosure reform laws. So you're here in California, you think that there's a problem with the rates of foreclosures in Arizona, and you want your organization to engage in urging them to be part of that reform effort, lobbying or not lobbying? All right, lobbying. You guys are good. So this is definitely lobbying. Again, they are legislators. You're communicating with them about specific legislation. It doesn't matter where they are. They are legislators, and the IRS would like you to count that activity against your direct lobbying limit. So again, all of the stuff that we've talked about just in this portion is about direct lobbying, and I'm going to move on now to talking about grassroots lobbying. And here we start from sort of the same premise. We're talking about communications. The audience changes. Here we're talking about communications with the general public, again about expressing a view on specific legislation. But then we need a fourth component, this call to action. The call to action is anything that you would do to encourage the recipient of the communication to take action. So here are some examples of what the IRS has said counts as a call to action. Telling someone to contact their legislator, that is a call to action. Providing a means to contact their legislator, so giving an address, a telephone number, or other contact information. Providing a mechanism to enable communication with your legislator. And I'll give you some examples of each of these in just a second. I apologize for the sirens in the background if you can hear those. But providing the mechanism would be something like, and I'm sure many of you have these on your website, when you put out an action alert, you have a sample letter and then a place for someone to type in their contact information, and you said you're going to send that information to the legislator. That's what they mean by providing a mechanism. And then simply identifying the legislators who have the power to influence that piece of legislation. So, for instance, when Justice Sotomayor was before Congress and her nomination was in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, we might have issued an action alert that said, contact the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee and urge them to support Justice Sotomayor's confirmation. Identifying the members of the body, the Senate Judiciary Committee, or specifically listing their members, identifying them by name, would count as identifying legislators and would constitute, with all of these other things, a call to action. So here's an alert that MALDEF sent out a couple years ago about the DREAM Act. Call Congress to pass the DREAM Act and tune in for the vote. So they're saying call Congress is a call to action, and they actually have a second call to action in this one down at the bottom. They specifically tell you to contact your representative in the House and the Senate, and they give you a phone number for doing it. So one of the reasons we include this action alert as an example is that this all counts as simply one grassroots lobbying communication. It doesn't count as multiple ones since there are multiple calls to action. So we always tell people, if you're going to do a call to action, if you're going to do a grassroots lobbying communication, make sure people know how to get in touch with those legislators and give them every mechanism they possibly can. So that's an example of how MALDEF did it. Here again, I was mentioning the mechanism for communicating with the legislators. You see on the left there's the letter, and then on the right, as I mentioned, is a place for you to put in your contact information, and the Natural Resources Defense Council is going to send that message for you to your legislators about HR 1837. All right, so we've talked about sort of the general rules, and I want to give you some tips for how you maximize your lobbying limit. One of the biggest ways that you can maximize that lobbying limit is by leaving off what we've just been talking about, that call to action. Leaving it off means that what would otherwise be a grassroots lobbying communication is no longer a grassroots lobbying communication. It's simply not lobbying. So here are some ways in which the IRS has told us that the grassroots lobbying communication becomes a non-lobbying communication because these do not count as calls to action. And they're a little bit counterintuitive. So language like learn more about a specific bill without more would not be a call to action and thus not grassroots lobbying. Telling someone simply to take action but not telling them how is not a call to action. Asking someone to support your efforts, not a call to action. And asking someone to get involved after you've explained an issue, not a call to action. So I'm going to go into some specific examples about that. So here's the first of them. This is an ad that ran in Maine. Maine has had some really good ad campaigns. We're using a few of them today. I'm sure there are others here in California, but these ones are the ones that we've chosen, and I hope that, that they illustrate the points clearly. So tell the legislature, raise the cigarette tax, call the Maine legislator. They give the phone numbers, protect our kids, not big tobacco. So is this a grassroots lobbying communication? Again, you can use your chat feature to type in there. That's right. Yeah, I'm seeing some yes answers come in here. This would be lobbying, and it would be grassroots lobbying if this was something that was, say, for instance, sent out in a mailer to people. Tell the legislature, raise the cigarette tax, call the Maine legislature. Again, it's communication with the general public, expressing a view, the cigarette tax, since they're asking you to call the Maine legislature, we're assuming here the cigarette tax is before the Maine legislature. So expressing a view about specific legislation, and then that call to action, calling a specific body, all would constitute that. Now, if this ad ran and was about a ballot measure, and we didn't say call the Maine legislature, but we said support the cigarette tax, this might be a direct lobbying communication. So you can see how easily you can transform one to another depending on what your audience is and how you engage in the communication. So here is how we have chosen to change the communication so that it's not grassroots lobbying anymore. You'll notice that we've taken off the call to action because we no longer provide a mechanism for how folks contact their legislators. There's no contact information. There's nothing about supporting it. Again, if this ad ran in a newspaper and there was a cigarette tax on the ballot that you were asking folks to support, this might count as a direct lobbying communication. But simply like this, it's not a grassroots lobbying communication in any case. All right, a couple more ways that you can maximize your lobbying limit. We already talked about administrative advocacy, influencing regulations, and we talked a little bit about legal advocacy, right, for bringing litigation. And I want to talk to you a little bit just about lobbying exceptions. So there are 4 exceptions that the IRS has given us from the definition of lobbying. The first is a nonpartisan analysis study or research. This is a fairly common way in which folks choose to engage in activities that are educational but don't count as lobbying. In order for, and I'm going to get into the specifics of that. The second one is a request for technical assistance. I'm also going to give you the details about that. Request for technical assistance has some special rules attendant to it, so it's not just any request. There's a self-defense exception. This is where there's a bill that's pending that would affect your ability to operate as a nonprofit. I will say here that it's not as broad as you might think. If the legislature is going to cut from the budget essentially all of the funding for your organization, the IRS has specifically said that doesn't count as that you can't use the self-defense exception to try to get them to change their minds. Your efforts would still be considered lobbying to influence the budget process. But there have been some recent bills in Congress about things like the charitable deduction and what counts and what doesn't. For the charitable deduction, and nonprofits weighing in on that might be able to use the self-defense exception. And then finally, examinations and discussions of broad social, economic, and similar problems. Now, you're asking yourself, how is this different from some of the other things that we do? Why would that be considered lobbying anyways? Because it's just a broad discussion. And my answer to you is, I don't know. I don't know what the IRS is thinking about reinforcing to us that this type of activity is an exception from lobbying, because we would say that it doesn't count as lobbying to begin with because it's not about specific legislation. But just so you know, these are the 4 articulated things in the IRS's regulations that constitute lobbying exceptions. So, as I mentioned, the nonpartisan analysis piece. You need a full and fair discussion of the issue. It has to be broadly disseminated. And once you do that, once you have a full and fair discussion, and that means that you're looking at both sides of the issue, you're not just presenting one side, you're presenting the pros and cons, and you get that information out to a wide audience, so you're not just sending it to a specific set of legislators, but you're sending it out to the public, or you're posting it on your website. That audience could include legislators, right? But it doesn't have to exclusively include them, just that so long as it's broadly disseminated. Then, once you've met those 2 pieces, you can express a view and include what we call an indirect call to action, what the IRS calls an indirect call to action, and that is saying that there is a piece of legislation that could fix this problem that we've broadly discussed fully and fairly. So this is a good way to sort of support some other work potentially that you're doing, but you want to be careful, and this is the last piece that's noted in that May section on the left, that there is a subsequent grassroots lobbying limit. So you just want to watch out for that subsequent use rule. If you end up doing what would otherwise be considered a nonpartisan analysis, and you end up using it in relation to grassroots lobbying. So for instance, you say there's a piece of legislation and now we want to go and support that piece of legislation, you have to keep in mind a couple of things. And if you have questions about the subsequent use rule, I'm happy to talk about them more either in the Q&A or at some other point in the future. So the other one that I wanted to give you some of the more technical rules for is the request for technical assistance exception for lobbying. So you need an invitation in writing on behalf of a committee, and the information that you provide has to be available to all members of that committee. And when you receive that, then you can express a view on specific legislation. So you're asking yourself, well, Rebecca, what if I get a phone call from a legislator who wants to know my opinion about a piece of legislation or says that we have some expertise that we can lend on it? If you don't want to engage in lobbying, then you would then what you would want to do is ask that legislator to get you an invitation in writing that comes from whatever committee he's working with, and that the information that you have would be available to all of the members of the committee and not just him or her. So that is just, you know, I think that happens a lot. We get, you know, once we develop these relationships with legislators, sometimes they call us and ask us for help, and we're happy to help them. And so long as we have room in our lobbying budget, that's fine. And if we don't, then this is one way for you to provide that assistance without running afoul of needing to count the time. So that is the 2 exceptions I want to talk about. I'm going to run through a couple more examples. I'm just going to go back. I saw that someone had typed in a question about the nonpartisan analysis piece, and I'm going to answer that question when we get to the Q&A, so just hold that thought for a second. So let's just do a couple more examples. Here's another, as I said, an ad from Maine. Maine has had these wonderful ads recently. So no paid sick days for restaurant employees, an enhanced dining experience for restaurant customers. Nearly half of all Maine workers lack paid sick days. Support your fellow Maine workers and their right to recover from illness without endangering public health or losing a day's pay. Contact your legislator and share your support of LD 1454, the Paid Sick Days Bill. So, do we think this is a lobbying communication? And is this a direct or a grassroots lobbying communication? All right, you guys are good. This is lobbying, and it is a grassroots lobbying communication. You've got both the contact your legislature, you've got the name of a specific bill, as well as the bill number. And so it's likely this was sent out to the general public. You're communicating with the general public instead of with individual legislators. So grassroots lobbying it is. And here's another example from the same campaign. She'll be your server tonight, and she's pretty sure it's contagious. Nearly half of all Maine workers lack paid sick days and are forced to work through their illnesses in order to pay the bills. Support LD 1454, the paid sick days bill. So is this lobbying or not lobbying? If it's lobbying, is it direct or grassroots? So this one is actually not lobbying. Saying support LD 1454 is not enough to be a call to action. You remember there were some specific examples that the IRS had given us, and simply asking people to support it is not grassroots lobbying. Someone asked where this ad appeared, and I believe it was in a magazine. It might have been in a bus stop. There's also a website there, mainsneezes.org. They're so cute and clever up there in Maine. So I think that it was a broad campaign that appeared both on their website and may have been in there. There is something called the mass media rule. I'm not going to get into that right now, but if you have questions about that, we can talk about it at another point. As far as I know, this bill, I have to look. I'll let you folks know afterwards. I'll be sure to let Connie know for the follow-ups whether the campaign was successful, and I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know off the top of my head. So those are just a couple of recap slides. And then, as I mentioned when we first started, we're talking about the IRS's limits on lobbying for C3s at all levels of government. You guys got that question right about the state legislators versus the in your own state and others. But the IRS is simply regulating how much lobbying you can do. The state and localities limit, or not limit, but they regulate the disclosure of the lobbying at those levels. So it doesn't necessarily impact how much you're doing. It's simply that who you need to tell and how you need to explain it. You folks in Los Angeles are not so lucky because there are a lot of local municipal lobbying disclosure measures at various agencies. There's a city one, a county one, I think the school board has its own, the Metropolitan Transit Authority has another one. That's all stuff that we help folks figure out here at Alliance for Justice, is how to keep track of all of the disclosure requirements and to keep track of your records for lobbying. But I just want to point out that there is a difference between what the IRS is saying, right, setting the overall limits on your lobbying, and what needs to be disclosed at, for instance, the state and local level. Of course, this is one of those tricky areas where it would be nice if everyone used the same definition of lobbying, but the state and local levels don't have the same definition frequently as the IRS does for lobbying. So there are just some things to keep in mind if you are lobbying at either the state or local level, that you become familiar with what and how those other entities are discussing and counting lobbying efforts. So one big area is here in California, the state of California considers administrative advocacy to be lobbying and therefore disclosable, or required to be disclosed. You still don't need to keep track of that time in terms of your overall IRS lobbying limit, but in terms of what you're telling the state of California about the work that you're doing, you need to measure your state-level administrative advocacy. So just putting that out there as one example. So just remember, nonprofits can and should lobby. 501c3s just have to stay within their annual lobbying limit. The 501h expenditure test makes planning and tracking lobbying much easier. Look out for those local laws on lobbying disclosure, as well as ballot measures. And then call us with any questions. I'm going to pause here for just a couple minutes and let folks ask any questions. Go back to that question that someone asked before about the nonpartisan analysis. Does this mean if you do research, if your research is nonpartisan analysis, one should keep track of the expenses due to potential subsequent use? And if you're thinking about using the report later to support your lobbying efforts, then yes, you want to, you would certainly want to keep track of what you're doing. And I'm just pulling up my own notes here. So if the initial distribution is greater than anything that then you can overcome the subsequent use rule if the initial distribution was greater than what you used it for in terms of lobbying, and anything over 6 months tends to not fall into the subsequent use rule. So look out for that 6 months after you publish time window, and no coordinating with other nonprofits. That also could run you afoul of the subsequent use rule. So, Connie, did you want to, I don't know if there were questions that you got, or if you want me to run through the questions that are here.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, if I can go ahead, we will go ahead and unmute the lines so that we can have some verbal Q&A. I know that's on a webinar. It's hard to kind of get that interaction, but I'm going to ask folks to use the raise hand feature, and here's the instructions. Note the raise hand button. Click on that, and you will see a hand raise up next to your phone line. We will then call the individuals accordingly in the queue. I'll announce your name, and then we'll unmute your line so you can ask your question. I'm going to ask folks to be very brief and very succinct with your questions so that we can get to as many as possible in the next 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you. Does anybody have questions?
While folks are raising their hand, Connie, I'm just going to answer one other question that came in on the chat. So someone asked whether I had said that if your budget was lower than $17 million, that the nonprofit should definitely use the 501h election. And I think that as a rule of thumb, yes, I would say that you probably would be better off using the 501h than not, because of the clear rules and guidance and all of that information that we've talked about today. If you don't elect the 501h, then you get a much smaller percentage, a much smaller piece of the pie to use for your lobbying activities. So it does tend to make sense for those organizations with budgets under the cap. Because you get up to $1 million with 17 million. You know, if you have a budget of 17 million or more, you get $1 million. So there may be even some slightly larger organizations who want to elect 501h just for the clarity it provides.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. I'm not seeing anybody's hands raised at the moment. So there was an earlier question also about, and here's the question, Rebecca. I was told that some actions taken by Los Angeles Planning Commission could count as lobbying if it was amending the zoning code. Can you clarify?
So I'm not sure. So I think generally the planning commissions, and I think this is why you're asking the question, general planning commissions would fall under the special purpose board, sort of exception to legislator rule. And I think that if the planning commission is, and I think for that reason, the IRS wouldn't count your work with the Planning Commission as lobbying, but you do want to go and just sort of check and see what happens with the information that comes from the Planning Commission. Are they then going to be going to some other body, like the County Board of Supervisors or some other place, to get approval for what they're doing, and are you asking them to weigh in with that other body? You might want to just think about whether that is that should then become a lobbying communication. So that's all I know about that. I don't know whether the Planning Commission itself has its own lobbying ordinance, like so many other places in Los Angeles, but I'm happy to look into that a little bit further and see if I can get some more clarity.
Please go. Thank you, Rebecca. If you do have any other questions, I will go ahead and invite folks to use the chat feature, and we will make sure to respond to those in the next opportunity for Q&A. I think we'll go on at this point, Rebecca, with your presentation.
Great. Thanks. I'll just wait for the ball. So that sort of is the overview of the legal rules for lobbying. And now, as I mentioned, we're going to turn to some tools that AFJ has developed to help you build your capacity, particularly around advocacy and community organizing. There, you see the logos there, our advocacy capacity tool, which we call ACT, and our community organizing capacity tool, which we call PowerCheck. ACT has been around for several years. And we have some good data about groups that are using it and how it's being used. PowerCheck we just launched at the end of last year, so we don't have as much data about it, but we've been getting some good feedback. So I hope that either or both of these is useful to you in your work. Just so that we're on the same page about the information here, I wanted to get us on the same page about what we mean by capacity. So here's a quote from the Grantmakers for Effective Organizations, who said that capacity describes a wide range of capabilities that nonprofits need in order to be effective, and we certainly hope that the tools that we've developed will give you that. So I think one of the things that Connie and Joan do on a daily basis is help organizations with some of these issues, and we just wanted to give you some more sort of tips and tools for how you can assess your capacity, and just to start off with, give you some bases for why we think it's important to assess your capacity for advocacy and organizing. As you saw from the legal rules, advocacy is complex. There's a lot that goes into it. The skills, the knowledge, the resources, the practices, all of that makes it very complex. So is community organizing. There is some level of funder knowledge that is helped by assessing your capacity. It gives you a look at the long-term view of how your organization is functioning and where you might want to either improve or step up or just reassess, frankly, what you're doing from the short term to the long term. And then, of course, it provides you with some, I think, encouragement and accountability. One of the things that we've certainly seen with our tools is that folks find encouragement in seeing that their capacities are greater than maybe they suspected after assessing them. And then it will increase your likelihood of success. We've really seen that organizations who use these tools have a greater likelihood of being able to successfully engage in either advocacy or community organizing by doing it. So nonprofit capacity includes the skills, the resources, the knowledge, and the practices that go into your assessment. But it does not talk about, it's not meant to address the effectiveness of your campaign. So it's really an internal measure as opposed to an external one. It's the first step in building a stronger organization is getting that clear picture of what you need to be effective and what your organization has or wants to have, and where you might want to partner with other organizations. And especially in this time of limited resources, this really helps us to do that. You really do need a baseline for your organization. The capacity assessment provides that snapshot in time, and our tools are really designed for this. So just a quick overview of kind of the difference between advocacy and community organizing. Sort of at the center of that is the nexus of policy and power. And we like to think of advocacy as mainly about policy work, whereas community organizing is mostly about power. So building power really is about engaging your constituents versus engaging legislators or some other decision makers in the advocacy world, community organizers often work on policy but focus on empowering constituents, including by getting constituents to do the work themselves and engaging them in sharing their own stories. So the two tools operate essentially in the same way, but the content is different between our ACT, which is on the advocacy side, and our Power Check, which is on the community organizing side. There are a number of different indicators that get used, and just in terms of figuring out who uses ACT, it's both individual organizations, but also coalitions, networks, and alliances. So if you're working with other organizations and you're trying to figure out a strategy for how you move a piece of advocacy or how you engage in a campaign together, the ACT tool is really designed for you to use together, and we've seen that in a number of different places where that's been effective. Foundations have also been using the tool with their grantees to help them figure out how to move issues that they care about, issues that help them advance their missions too. So this is just a snapshot of the tool itself, so you can get an idea of what it looks like. It's available online. It's completely free. So you can also ask for a PDF copy, but really it's very easy to take it online. And these are just a couple of the different sections that we have there. One of the reasons why I've shown you the conducting advocacy piece and the preparation piece is that in some of these areas you can put that you're relying on partners instead of just your own internal capacity. So that's sort of an interesting feature of the tool. So the broad categories of indicators under the ACT are divided this way: the advocacy goals, plans, and strategies, conducting advocacy, so how you're actually conducting it, advocacy avenues, organizational operations to sustain advocacy. And this one, I think the thing to think about with both of these tools is that especially if you're a service organization who hasn't typically engaged in advocacy before, the ACT tool is a great way for you to think about what your internal capacities are. And we can talk about that a little bit more here. So these are some of the components of some of the sort of subsection indicators. I'm not going to run through all of them. You kind of get an idea here. The idea is just basically helping you develop a well-thought-out advocacy agenda to keep everyone in the organization on the same page. We've seen the Texas YMCA, for instance. They have a statewide organization, and they've been using the ACT for a while now. It really has become a blueprint for them in how they have developed their advocacy program, which is now very active. It wasn't very active before, and now they've been able to, through the ACT, develop a program that they're using with their affiliates across the state, and that's been really rewarding to watch that happen. Here is the conducting advocacy. You see some of the same slides. It's actually my son there in the blue jacket at his first little protest. It was a Black Lives Matter protest here in the Bay Area, and it's my colleague Isaiah on the phone there conducting some advocacy. But all of the pieces of conducting advocacy are what you might think. This includes the messaging, how you are in terms of talking with the media, what your field operation looks like. Here's especially where you talk about your partners. We have seen, for instance, here in Oakland, the East Oakland Building Healthy Communities Collaborative, which is funded by the California Endowment, used ACT to figure out some of this work for them, and ended up deciding that based on their use of the tool that they needed to do some more work around messaging and partnering with other organizations. And so that's just an example of how we've seen this used. Again, advocacy avenues, we've talked about those already: administrative, legislative, electoral, litigation. These are all ways in which you might engage in advocacy, and just getting you thinking about what the best use of your time and resources are. Again, operations to sustain advocacy looks really internally at how committed the leadership is to advocacy, knowing and observing sort of related moves that are happening in the field, how you might be seeking funding to support your work, and developing a decision-making process that fits the needs for quick decisions, how nimble you are as an organization, and how those decisions get made. So that's really broad overview of the Act, just so folks know what that looks like. And then, again, if you have questions, please either type them in. Yeah, I think type them in at this point. You can hold on to them till the end. We'll open the line up again. But moving to PowerCheck, some of these are going to, as I said before, sort of look the same. There are 5 big areas in which PowerCheck assesses your capacity to engage in community organizing. Not all organizations, and I should have mentioned this for ACT as well, there are a couple of pieces where your organization may just not have any desire to, or ability or want to use all of the features. But when we were talking about conducting advocacy and your advocacy avenues under the Act, you could rely on partners. And here, number 4, community consensus building, that's a piece that we also think that not all organizations end up doing as part of their organizing work, and so, it's left optional. Of course, community organizing can be a complicated business, and to be successful, it's important to prepare for success by understanding your organization's readiness to engage and empower constituents. PowerCheck breaks those broad categories that you see here down into their components to allow us to better understand each of them and identify where and how good organizing is happening and how we can best support and grow it if it's not happening the way that we want it to be. So PowerCheck is, as I mentioned before, a brand new free tool that Boulder Advocacy has made available to make it easy for nonprofits and evaluators and the funders to assess capacity to engage in community organizing, to plan successfully, and to track progress over time. PowerCheck is really designed, just like ACT is, for everyone to use it between the beginners to the more sophisticated folks, and just to better catalyze your preparation. I'm not going to run through each of the sub-indicators here, though I have slides on them. We can talk about them more later. I want to leave some time for questions. So I'm just going to skip ahead. This is what the results look like. We can break it down for you by indicator or by section. And just to give you one example of an organization that has used PowerCheck before, we know that the Colorado Together Network has now used PowerCheck twice to help them with some planning, and they're obviously not beginners, so just to reinforce the idea that these are not tools that need to be used by people who are just new to it, but could be used by others. If you are new to it, obviously the tools are very helpful to help you find things that maybe you hadn't thought of and to figure out a plan or path forward. So for more information, all of the information that we did in the first half of the presentation on the lobbying rules is available on our website in the Being a Player publication, which you see there on the left. As I mentioned, ACT and PowerCheck are also available on our Boulder Advocacy website, which is here. So www.boulderadvocacy.org. We have offices here in Oakland, California, where I'm based, and we also have an office down in Los Angeles, where my colleague Nona Randwa is based. She's our Southern California Program Director. So regardless of where you are in the state, we have staff located nearby. We also have an office in Washington, D.C., and are very excited in the next week or so to be opening our office in Texas. So if you have friends and colleagues across the country, AFJ really supports work that happens in all 50 states. As I mentioned before, there's the advocacy@afj.org email if you want to send us questions, and then the hotline 866-NP-LOBBY or 866-675-6229. You feel free to email or call us at those numbers at any time to just ask any additional questions that you might have, whether about the tools or about the rules. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook and keep up to date on all of that stuff. So, Connie, did you want to leave a little bit of time for some questions here?
Yes, please. Let's go ahead and do that. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that very informative run-through. Lots of great information. I want to just invite folks now to enter any questions that you might have in the chat room space. Again, here's the chat feature that you should be using. We will try to certainly get to as many questions in a very, very brief period of time that we have today. In case we do not get to all of your questions, Rebecca has very kindly offered to respond to those post-webinar. So we will be following up with individuals regarding those questions that you might have we don't get to today. So as I'm just sort of glancing through the chat box to see if there's anything that's come in, I did actually have one question, and you kind of referred to it a little bit earlier, Rebecca, while we're waiting for maybe a couple of folks to get on. You know, for instance, as you know, many of the folks on the audience come from a variety of different backgrounds and organizations that provide different kinds of services, and there are many who do not, on a regular basis, you know, conduct advocacy or lobbying activities. What would you say would be kind of, you know, the first to-do for those particular service organizations to kind of get them started?
Well, I think, you know, as I mentioned, I think that the ACT is a great tool to just give you an overall sense of where your strengths and weaknesses are, and you know, and it's not designed to, you know, have funders keep track of it. It's not really for, it doesn't have to be for anybody's purposes but your own in figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. And that includes everything from planning to conduct advocacy. That's really the first section of the ACT, is about planning to be an advocate, as well as then sort of going deeper into those other areas where you're talking about, like, okay, now we have a campaign, how are we messaging it, that sort of thing. So just getting started doing the first piece, and I think I didn't mention that before, but both ACT and PowerCheck are designed and can be designed and customized for whoever's using them to do them in chunks. So when I mentioned the East Oakland Building Healthy Communities Initiative, they only used a portion of the ACT because there was something very specific that they wanted to measure. And so for organizations that are thinking about getting into this, I'd recommend that they at the very least take the planning piece of ACT. And it's really designed not to be taken just once. You could take it multiple times, right? So you take it when you're planning, then you do some of the work that maybe is suggested, or advance whatever ideas you have to the next level, and come back and take it again and see what it says about how that's worked out and where else you might go next. So.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm not seeing any other questions at this point in time. So I wanted to first thank you, Rebecca, for your time and your expertise this afternoon, as well as the participation from our audience. I'm going to punt this back over to Joan to wrap up and bring our webinar time to a close for this afternoon.
Thank you, Connie, and thank you, Rebecca. This was really very informative. We had a lot of people on, and a lot of people stayed on the entire time, and I think that's testament to how worthwhile this session was. Connie led our component in our training that I mentioned earlier on policy, and so it made sense for her to moderate this component today, and I think it really allowed us to do a much deeper dive in this topic with someone who does it 24/7. I'm sure, Rebecca, this is a big part of your life, as we saw with your son at the rally and the protest. So I just want to remind everyone that you will be getting an evaluation. It will probably come early next week, an evaluation form. And with that, you will also get the link to the recording and the slides from today's presentation, which I'm sure you will want because it was so worthwhile. We really ask you to do the evaluation. It's critically important to us and to the California Wellness Foundation that we have a sense, and I'm sure Rebecca would very much want to see the results, see how this worked for you, and any suggestions you might have for the future. So you can see how to get in touch with Connie and me. And again, we just want to thank you very much. This was a really great session, and thank you for your time and your interest, and we wish you the best with your lobbying and advocacy in the future. Good afternoon.